Hello everyone, very good morning. This is Satish Kumar from Mindfire Solutions, and I'm coming up with my fourth video on the Symfony series, how to have a CRUD operations in Symfony forms. So basically, we had covered up how to install Symfony and the folder structure and how to have a simple form, as part of your form builder in controller sections. So moving on next, we'll be covering up more on how to have a simple CRUD operations. When I say CRUD, it's insert, delete, update, and select methods. So um, we'll start on with that. Mm, I have a vendor, I mean entity, a doctrine entity called as vendor.php. I'm not going to get deep into entities or doctrine or propel now, but basically I'm using doctrine ORM as part of Symfony. You can find it in the Symfony documentation. So this vendor has some fields like ID, which is going to be the primary key, name, address lines, employees, and user, created at, created by, deleted date. So the basic audit fields will be there. And if you see in the controller, so this is my vendor controller which resides inside the src folder, acme demo bundle, the controller folder. And this vendor controller extends the default controller of Symfony, and we have the basic index action which is going to fetch all the data from the database and list it down in the view part. So let's quickly check like how this vendor directory works. Okay, so here you can see there is a small vendor list with ID, name, address line 1 and action, and there are no items, so it's not showing anything. And you have a link to create a new entry. If I have to quickly go on to the view part, so this is the basic stuff. As I said earlier, twig has this inheritance concept, so I'm extending the base html.twig, and I'm just modifying only the body block of it. So in the body block you can see a h1 tag which notes vendor list, and then a table which has four columns of each row, which starts with id, name, address, and one, and some respective actions. I think this is fine. And since we don't have any action, I mean any data in the list, it's not showing anything, which should be fine for now. So let's quickly move on to how to have a create action. um, so a create action gets a form type from a specific form. Earlier we had discussed how to have a form in controller with the use of create form builder. The form builder is an inbuilt function in the basic Symfony controller which provides you some facade classes or facade methods to build a beautiful form. So we can do the same thing with another form called vendor type as a form class, which can reside in acme demo bundle form directory followed by a type class called vendor type. And this is extended by abstract type of Symfony. Symfony has numerous independent modules, and form is one sort of independent component of a Symfony. Similarly, you have form builder interface, which is going to be an argument for your build form method, and some option resolvers which you can pass as and default options to the form class. So let's not go get deep into form events, which as of now, which we'll be covering in separate video. That's a very big vast concept. So let's move on with this vendor type form. In this vendor type class we have three methods. One is to name your form. If you are not giving the name, it takes some default name, and here set default options is the function where you can define from which entity or which database table this form type should inherit from. And in the builder class you have a name, address line 1, user denotes the user, the logged in user, or any user with whom you can associate with. So this user is nothing but a user id in the vendor table, and that will act as a foreign key for the user table. As of now I'm commenting out this particular section of code, which I'll explain it later, because this is something which is not part of your database table structure. Let me pull that entity again. So if you see this vendor.php, you don't see, I mean, there is a user record which is inversed by user ID in the table user, but whereas you cannot see anything called state. So this is a kind of field which is a non-mapped property of a entity vendor. So we'll cover up in the next section, so which is not important as of now. And moving on to the controller section, you can see a create action where you bind the form with that form type and with a empty entity, empty vendor entity, and you are going to bind the form. So this create action is taken from the new action. First of all, it binds the form and it renders the form on the screen. Let's quickly see. This is the HTML part where you have a block body, and you get the form encoding type of form, and then you display some widgets out there. So where this form is coming from, this particular variable in the twig, it's coming from this vendor controller. You create a form object and a form cannot render itself on the twig, so you have to create a view, and that view will be passed on to the twig. So whenever you get an object, you have to turn it to be a view part. So you got the form with from a create form of form type class vendor type, and then you create the view that gets displayed in the twig section. Let's quickly see like how it looks like for creating an entry. So it's simple. You got these three fields. I'm going to add this test one, some blah blah blah. I'm going to go with user one, create, and here you go. You got this one as a show method. So when you see back to the list, you have um, the ID 3, the name and the associated address value. If you want to show user records, you can also show user records with the username. So this is pretty much simple, and you can also edit the same. Before moving on to updating the records, let's see like what happens when you submit the form. In the new.html.twig, you see the path vendor create. The vendor create is nothing but the name of the routing pattern which will go to the create action here. Again, you will create the form object. You will bind the form object with the request parameter. The request is a kind of service. It's a kind of synthetic service. We are not going to get deep into what is a synthetic service, because we'll be covering up in our video on services. So this service as an argument doesn't need to be part of the routing pattern, and it can directly bind with the form object. And the next step is you are checking whether it's a valid form or not, whether it passes all its validation constraints or not. I mean, just in case if you have any validation constraint. And then you set up some the audit field records, and then persist it to your entity manager, flush it, and if the flushing happens perfectly, it goes to your vendor show method where you show the entities that has been added. Else it will get back to you on vendor.new.html.twig. It means it takes you back to the form, showing that there is something going wrong in the form submission, and you have to add or edit fields onto that. And moving on to the edit option, you can edit at any point of time, and that will show here. Again, if you go back to the list, it gets updated here. Edit is more or less similar to that of your create action. The only difference is while editing, you already have a record in the database, and you have an associated identifier, a primary key, which can identify a particular record from the entity and bind it to the form while showing it on the screen. Say for example, if you have a create new entry, there are no entries, it's a totally new form. Whereas if you have any data, and if you want to edit this is an update record, and it should populate with the record that is existing in the database. So in order to bind the data to the form while showing it on the screen, you have to do something like this. In the edit action, you get the entity manager, find the ID. When you're editing, you are going to set it with an identifier, and that gets pulled up the data from its database ORM structure, and if there is no entity, it means that you have passed a wrong identifier for which there is no data in the database. If there is entity, then in the create form you are going to bind that entity with the form. So now the form has a form object associated or binded with the database data in it. And so that's it. You have this edit form, and it creates a view for it. So while updating also, it's something very simpler. You got the ID, you're going to bind the ID with the form request, and then or show it on the screen. So the same happens in update. You get the ID, you fetch the data from the database. You can bind it with the edit form with the request, check for its validity. If it passes the validity constraint, you just process the data into the database, and then redirect it to the vendor show method with that particular ID. So I think we had almost covered up listing of views, which is nothing but your read operation or a select method operations. Then we covered up create with the new form action, and how it process once the form is submitted. And we also covered up how to update an existing data in the database, how to update the same after passing the validation constraints. Now moving on, we'll be covering up the delete method, the last part of your CRUD operations. So this is nothing but you have a delete button here. You just click on this, and here you go, the entry got deleted. So let's see what is the backend logic behind this. um, Here we have a delete action which gets the request from the ID, and then deletes it. So you can directly delete with entity manager remove, whereas what we are doing here is we are creating a delete form, form from not from a class form type. Rather we are going to build our own form using create form builder, which we showed in the earlier Symfony simple form video. So this create form builder will fetch the ID from the list, and adds the ID to the hidden form field. And once you get the form object, you bind the request, check for its validity, and then remove the entity from the entity manager, flush it. Though we are not going to cover more on this doctrine logic, but you can assume that this is the normal database operations that you can do. Here we just wanted to show you like how the form type and the associated routing patterns is going hand in hand with your view part. So building a normal or basic CRUD operations for those who start with Symfony is going to be very much simple task. Moving on from this video, we'll be covering up how to have a composite form. This is also part of this video, this particular vendor controller logic. Maybe we can cover up as a separate video. Composite form, how to have a custom field type, and then how to play with the event listeners and subscribers of form. And slowly we'll move on to the ascetic areas as well. Thanks for watching this. Thanks for your time. Bye bye.